All right, guys, today we're going to start talking about the Persian Wars and what effect that had on the Greek culture throughout history. Now, we've talked about the Athenians, we've talked about the Spartans, and their civilizations and how different they were, and actually how they didn't like each other too much. But actually, they actually came together for a common cause. They put aside their differences for a common cause, which really was a cause that was worth it, because if they wouldn't have come together, it would have caused the destruction of Greek culture as we know it today. And why is that important? Well, later on we'll talk about some of the contributions that the Greeks gave to us as Americans today. It has to do with our country, our culture, our government, all that kind of stuff. And it was very important. If that culture would have been destroyed, things would be a lot different in our daily lives. So, the Athenians and the Spartans, and plus other city-states around the Greek peninsula, came together against this one common goal, basically to try not to be annihilated from another culture that was coming in to take over. And that's what we're going to talk about. That's what the Persian Wars had to do with. Okay, so that's what we're going to start talking about. All right, now, we've talked about the Spartans and the Athenians. We talked about that danger, and the Helot rebellion is what caused the Spartans to really focus on being a military state. The Athenians, not so much. They became a democracy. And the difference between the rich and the poor, which we'll talk a little bit, led to that. But they were all about learning and culture and being better. You couldn't find two different cultures in Greek society than the Athenians and the Spartans. But when they came together, they were a pretty unstoppable force, and you'll see how unstoppable and how unbelievable. You might not even believe some of these stories. This is not mythology. This stuff actually happened, and you'll be amazed at some of the things that they did together. Now, first of all, before we get into that, let's talk about the Bronze Age. Now, the Bronze Age was a time when people were making things out of bronze. And remember, that is tin and copper mixed together to make things out of metal. Now, these things were not easy to get, and they were expensive because of that. So not everybody had them. So if you wanted to make weapons out of bronze, you were kind of limited on how many you could make. Now, only rich citizens could serve in armies, because during that time, the military, if you served in the military, you had to provide your own weapons. So if you had these expensive swords and shields and armor made out of bronze that was really expensive, somebody that's really doesn't have much money is not going to serve in the military, because you're not going to have anything to defend yourself. And what good is a soldier without weapons? So usually the rich were the ones that were serving in the military. Now, what they did find, though, later on, is they found iron. Now, iron is one of the most abundant resources in all of the world. In fact, our molten core of the earth is made out of molten iron. So you can find quite a bit of it. And guess what? It's a lot stronger than bronze. So once they discovered how to actually mold this into stuff that they needed, iron really started to be the thing that everybody started to use to make weapons and tools and things like that. Much cheaper. Now, why is that important? Well, remember, if people had to buy their own weapons, and bronze was expensive, and iron wasn't, and iron was better, more abundant, cheaper, that makes things a lot better for military, because now you can have rich, poor, whoever, and they all can afford the weapons, and now you have larger armies to protect yourselves or to go and conquer your enemies. It's a pretty big deal. Now, not only weapons that you would think of would be swords, shields, armor, things like that, but there's actually another type of weapon that is more dangerous than any of those things. And it resides right up here. And that was the new kind of weapon, and that's what made the Greeks very strong. Now, foot soldiers, which were people that were doing their battling over the land, they were called hoplites, and they stood side by side. And each one of them had a long spear and a shield in the other hand. That's why a lot of times if you see, like, for example, the movie 300 or anything like that, you see them with huge shields with spears, like in the picture here. And the soldiers behind the front row, they put their shields over their heads to protect them, and it protected them from archers. Okay, so you've got this row of soldiers at the very front. They've got their shields out, they've got their spears out in front of them. Then the rows behind them They have their spears pointing kind of in the spaces between the shields of the front row, going out that way, and then they take their shields not in front of them, but to put them over them. Now think about this. Now you've got 5 or 6 rows behind you that have that. You're almost like a human tank. And if archers are trying to shoot from a distance, and of course those arrows are going to come from above, if it's from a long distance, they're just going to bounce off those shields, and they're not going to hurt anybody. That makes those archers pretty ineffective. Now this formation was called a phalanx, and it became the most powerful fighting strategy in all of the ancient world during that time. Nobody had thought about that, and that came from some really good strategy from the Greeks. And that's what made them an unstoppable fighting force. Now, I'm not just talking about the Spartans, I'm talking about Greece as a whole, because once they figured out this formation, nobody else in the world had seen anything like that and didn't know how to defend it. And it kind of made them unstoppable. Now, let's start talking about the Persian War. Now, the Persians were a humongous culture that had taken over much of Eastern Asia, or Eastern and Western Asia. And it was huge. And they were moving west into the area where Greece was. And they were conquering all these civilizations. They were just running through them, and they were unstoppable. Now, where the Greeks and the Persians really started to get together was in a place called Ionia. Now, the Greeks had long been settled there since about 546 BC, but the Persians came in and conquered that area. And, of course, when somebody conquers you, you're not real happy about it. Well, the Ionian Greeks revolted against these Persians. Well, when the Athenians found out about how these Ionian Greeks, their brothers, basically, had revolted against the Persians, well, Athenians said, hey, we're going to help them out. So they sent soldiers and ships to aid them. Now, unfortunately for the Ionian Greeks and the Athenians, the Persian king, his name was Darius the Great, he defeated those Ionians that were revolting along with the Athenian ship and soldiers, and this made Darius very angry. So angry, in fact, that he vowed that one day he would destroy Athens, totally wipe it off the map in revenge for them helping the Ionians against the Persians. This is kind of how it all started, at a place called Marathon. It's called the Battle of Marathon. Now, you probably have heard of Marathon before. You think of maybe your parents have run marathons before. And that's where it comes from. If you know what a marathon is, it's an event where you run a long, long distance. Well, those events are actually named after this battle, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so at this battle, the Persian fleet had about 25,000 men that went across the Aegean Sea, and they landed northeast of Athens on this plain called Marathon. There was only 10,000 Athenians. So you've got 25,000 Persians, 10,000 Athenians. But, remember the phalanx formation? Yeah, pretty powerful. They were all arranged, these Greeks were all arranged in that phalanx formation. Those human tanks, basically. Now, of course, the Greeks were vastly outnumbered, but they weren't scared of the Persians. So they charged. Now, the Persians, they wore light armor so they could move a little bit better, and they lacked a lot of training in land combat. And they were no match for these disciplined Greek phalanx formations. And after several hours, the Persians fled the battlefield. Remember, they outnumbered them, 25,000 to 10,000. And after a couple hours, just a couple hours, the Persians were like, oh, we're in trouble, and they were fleeing the battlefield. They had the numbers, 2.5 times to 1. That's insane. The Persians lost more than 6,000 men before they retreated. Now, to contrast that with how many the Athenians lost, 200. That's it. 200. Of their 10,000 troops, they only lost 200 soldiers. That's insane. Against 6,000 Persian soldiers that they destroyed? Yeah, that's pretty wild. Now, though the Athenians won the battle, Athens was now defenseless. Okay, they sent all their soldiers to this battle of Marathon against the Persians. Now, according to tradition, army leaders chose a young runner that would race back to Athens to let them know what the news was. I mean, they couldn't call them on the cell phone and, hey, we won the battle. Everybody party. Didn't do that. Everything had to be done on foot. So this guy ran from Marathon back to Athens to let them know that the Persians were defeated. And so that if there was other Persian soldiers that would go to Athens, that if they got outnumbered, the Athenians wouldn't surrender. Okay, so they wanted them to know that, hey, our troops won. Hey, if they come, don't surrender. We're coming back. So this guy, he ran from the battlefield at Marathon 26 miles. He ran 26 miles to Athens, because that's how far the battlefield was at Marathon from Athens. He ran 26 miles nonstop to deliver the message, rejoice, we conquer. Now, after that, he collapsed and actually died, unfortunately. But this helped the Athenians, because once the Persians retreated, they thought, well, now Athens is defenseless. Let's go to them and destroy Athens, and then it'll be okay. Well, when the Athenians got the message, they knew, oh, wait, we don't need to give up. We need to fight until our troops get back. The Persians sailed in the harbor, and by that time they were prepared and heavily defended. And the Persians said, oh, man, they're heavily defended? Yeah, we're going to get out of here. We're out of here. And they retreated. Isn't that pretty wild? Now, that's just the beginning of the story. It gets better than that, too. The Persians and the Greeks fought many battles with each other because the Persians were this huge empire, and they wanted to conquer the world. They thought because of this little puny little area, this puny little civilization, that they were just going to run over them like nothing. So the Persians were very, very, very arrogant. They had no idea how tough that these Greeks were and how many times that they would get pushed back by this small little puny little Greek civilization. We'll talk about that more tomorrow.